The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to speak to you all this evening. I want to thank Roland for the invitation. What he asked me to speak on is quite simply to share some thoughts about the work that I have to engage in on a daily basis, thinking about world affairs and how it affects us, especially how it affects us as Christians. So the question for us to ponder tonight is how we as Christians understand and navigate this world that we are in, and it is a world increasingly defined by, at least from my perspective, a lot of great geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts, right? And a lot of uncertainty and disruption. So we live in Singapore. We are living in this little red dot, but as you know, we are probably the most open economy in the world. So effectively what that means is that whatever happens out there is going to affect us in here. And the point being that a lot is happening out there. So let me begin by sharing some thoughts about the world we live in, bearing in mind that we as believers, we are called to be in this world even though we are not to be of this world, right? To me, I think that is a very important point. Why? Because sometimes you look at all the uncertainty, you kind of want to just, distance yourself from it, right? All the challenges, all the temptations. But we need to ask ourselves if that is really our calling. Remember, even when the nation of Israel was enslaved by Babylon. You remember in Jeremiah 29, Jeremiah wrote to them and exhorted them not only to build their lives in Babylon, but to contribute to the state for their welfare, their own welfare. The welfare of Israel was tied to the welfare of Babylon. I read for you Jeremiah 29. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives, have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Furthermore, as we know, when Christ prayed, his high priestly prayer recorded in John 17, he prayed not for God to take his people out of the world, right, but to keep them from the evil one in this hostile world. So we are still meant to be here. There's a purpose for us being here. We are called not to be isolated, but to be engaged. Sent out as sheep among wolves, as it were. So that is my starting premise. So these are very trying times for the world, and there's much political and economic uncertainty. I think we are at a historical juncture, if you ask me, where on the one hand you have changing modes of production. On the other hand, you have a changing distribution of political and economic power, and it's all taking place at the same time. What do I mean by this? What I mean is, you have the advent of what you can call the techno digital revolution, right? And this is fundamentally changing production, changing supply chains. Wealth is moving from the West to Asia. But at the same time, we have growing resentment and resistance, giving rise to geopolitical and geoeconomic dislocation, competition, rivalry, even conflict. The globalization that has governed relations and interactions among countries since the end of World War II, what some in my business call the international rules-based order, it's coming under very great strain. The global trading system is primed for change because of nationalism, because of the downturn in relations between the US and China, the biggest and second biggest economies in the world. The US, as you know, is ramping up tariffs. The Chinese are also tariffing American goods, but they cannot match it, so they find other ways to push. And as if to force home the point, the US is now renegotiating trade agreements with other countries with special provisions that allow them to withdraw if they don't like the kind of negotiations that those particular countries are renegotiating with third-party countries that are not, so to speak, market economies, which is an euphemism for China. Okay, so things are not going to get better anytime soon. This trade war will generate challenges, but of course it will create opportunities as global supply chains shift. I'm happy to talk about that, maybe later if you all have any questions about this. I think it's not necessarily all doom and gloom. Sometimes I have to speak to the commercial and financial sector, so you know, you got to be a bit more uplifting, right? So there are opportunities in challenges. Even if there are opportunities, at the end of the day, destabilized relations between the US and China is not good for anyone, right? And so that is one of the problems with the trade war. But really the issues are not just about trade. We're looking at the technology war also. Yeah, and it's a technology war that strikes at the heart of Chinese national ambitions to become the leading technological power by 2025. Okay. And it's also becoming a currency war. Those of you who follow the trade war, you know the Americans keep accusing the Chinese of deliberately keeping the renminbi depressed in order to bolster their exports. So this is an ongoing issue for both countries. Apart from these issues, there are other issues, other challenges that we face. A couple of weeks ago, the UN Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change released their latest report, which forecast the urgent need to reduce, to cut carbon emissions and to eliminate, reduce coal-driven electricity. Whether natural or man-made, if you ask me, I think climate change is real. It's something that we have to deal with. And interestingly, I think for us as Christians in particular, why do I say that? Because you know, we are called to rule over God's creation, right, on earth. But does that mean we abuse it? Or are we called to be good stewards, you know, of the resources that God has bestowed onto us? And this is actually, in the US, this is a matter of quite significant debate among, within the evangelical community and within the Christian community in general. Again, as far as I'm concerned, it's a real challenge. Food cycles are increasingly erratic. Water resources are diminishing, and there's a lot of concern in my business in security studies. There's a lot of concern about water conflicts and water wars breaking out, especially in the Middle East. Then, of course, there's terrorism, something that is a bit, I suppose, a bit too close for home for us, even though we have a very effective security forces and security infrastructure here in Singapore. You know, we are located in archipelagic Southeast Asia and surrounded by countries that are, okay, I wouldn't say they're struggling with the problem. I think they're trying their best to manage it, but it's a real problem for them, right? And the borders being as porous and easily crossed as they are today, it can quite easily become a problem for us as well. Of course, these are the broad geopolitical and geoeconomic trends, and then there's the security challenges, but again, these are not the only matters of concern. We are now living in the age of the so-called fourth industrial revolution. And just like the three previous industrial revolutions, it is a time of great disruption and uncertainty. The first and third industrial revolutions were driven by steam, electricity, and automation, which enabled not only mass production, upon which a lot of modern economies are built on, but also created massive supply chains that greatly disrupted the global economy at various times of human history. And today, we are facing a similar kind of dynamics with the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, etc., etc. One of the primary concerns is, of course, jobs, right? But I would say that the point is not so much the loss of jobs, because historians have shown that over the course of the last three industrial revolutions, jobs have been lost, but new jobs have been created. And in fact, the World Economic Forum has forecasted that over the next 4 to 5 years, while the fourth industrial revolution would probably cost about 70 million jobs worldwide, it will create 130 million jobs in other areas. So the issue is not job creation, job loss. The issue is, number one, how do we position the 70 million who lose their jobs now to take advantage of the 130 million jobs that are going to be created? And number two, can we position them fast enough to prevent, to mitigate the kind of social and political dislocation and disruption that can give rise to social and political unrest, right? So the point, obviously, again, is that we live in times of great uncertainty for the individual, for the community, and for nations. So as Christians, what do we say or do in the face of disruption? Let me make 4 broad points that serve as a frame of reference for us and a way of thinking about geopolitical and geoeconomic problems and challenges from a Christian perspective. Okay? The first point is this: disruption is not a concept that is foreign to Christianity. And I stress that point on 2 counts. Number one, Christ himself was a disruptor, right? If you think about it, give you an example, the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in Matthew 5, 6, the Sermon on the Plains, recorded in Luke 7. The Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain flew in the face of what was prevailing wisdom of that day. They articulated what was, in effect, if I may use the term, a counterculture to the day. Right? Blessed are the peacemakers, giving to the needy, building up treasures in heaven and not on earth. These were, especially for those of you who are born as Christians, you grew up believing in this, right? And you don't second guess it. But at that point in time in history, these were earth-shattering kind of notions to the people then. Contradicted the norms of the day, right? Christ overturning the money tables at the temple, right? A physical manifestation of the destruction of the order, the corrupt order of the day. So Christ was a disruptor. At the same time, Christianity was a disruption, right? In very much the same way. It was a threat to the early church. When the early church was formed, it was a threat to the prevailing social order of the day, where you had all these deities that, this was Roman society, right? That the people of Rome worshipped. And then here came Christianity. The early church was a subversive institution in that regard. And it's not just the early church. The Reformation was a source of great disruption as well. Christianity in Asia, when it was brought to Asia by colonial powers, by missionaries, It was a source of great disruption to traditional Asian society, right? The notion that you have a personal God, a God that you can have a personal relationship with, as opposed to the God of Islam, who is a distant God, as opposed to notions of enlightenment, or being able to achieve enlightenment, as opposed to the notion that all around you are different gods, different deities, who have different specific functions, right? Christianity basically overturned all that. And equally important, in all the gods that prevailed in Asia at the time, there was no sense of a God who unilaterally made a covenant, Genesis 15, unilaterally made a covenant with his chosen people. Okay? So that's the first big point. The second is, because Christianity is so closely associated with disruption, disruption itself should not be anything new to a Christian. It has a place in God's order. Disruption has a place in God's order. We need to remember that while all these developments that I talked about earlier in geopolitics, in technology, these have understandably prompted anxiety and concern and created a sense that this is all new and this is all urgent. In reality, it really isn't new. You see, we talk about creating all this new technology. In reality, humans cannot truly create anything. No, we cannot truly create anything. I say this as someone coming from the Nanyang Technological University that are creating all sorts of things, or claim to be creating all sorts of things, right? But no, why do I say that? For something to be created, it has to be brought into existence from nothing. Okay? That is the concept of creation. Only God can do that. Right? The Bible reminds us that 1 Timothy 6:7, we brought nothing into this world. And of course we will leave with nothing worldly, right? Despite the idolization of human ingenuity and innovation, we can do no more than repurpose what God has created. Okay, we don't create. We take it, we repurpose it, we do things with it, but we don't create. Okay. So whether the challenge is technological advancements of the fourth industrial revolution or rivalry among great powers, perhaps even on the verge of war, all this has been seen before. Okay, if you look through the Bible, Daniel, for example, the book of Daniel, chapter 7 or 8, talked about, these were the beginning. This was the second half of the book of Daniel, right? When he, the prophesying of what lies ahead. And there was a lot of description about the great geopolitics of the day, the rise and fall of kingdoms, especially the Babylonian Empire, which Daniel prophesied. Some would even point to the advent of technology as being prophesied in the Bible, right? When Daniel talks about increase in knowledge, chapter 12. Satan's control of the economy, nuclear weapons, and the dangers of nuclear weapons in Zechariah 14. In fact, the Bible prepares us for the theme of continuity in our lives on earth. Let me read for us the first few verses of Ecclesiastes 1, which I'm sure you are all familiar with. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes. The earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down, and hasten to the place where it rises. The winds blow to the south and go around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. There is nothing new under the sun. This, I submit to you, is the broad strategic perspective that we must have as Christians. Yeah? We are the stewards of God's creation. We are not the masters of our own. Third, While Christianity was born out of disruption, God is a God of a godly order. Okay? God is a God of a godly order. This is reiterated in 1 Corinthians 14, right? God is not a God of confusion, He's a God of peace. There was order and structure from the very beginning of creation. Even the angelic hosts are organized, there's hierarchy and order in the ranks of the angelic hosts. Now, there is not necessarily a disconnect here, although it may seem so at first glance, right? Disruption, Christianity, order, God's order. No disconnect. Why? You see, Christianity was a disruption by virtue of it subverting the order of the fallen world. Okay? And it was because we live in a fallen world that God sees the need to restrain the most evil impulses of men by empowering the state, for example. Let me quote to you. I'm going to quote to you from the Belgic Confession, Article 36. It's one of the signal documents of the Protestant Reformation for those of you who are not aware of it. We believe that because of the depravity of the human race, our good God has ordained kings, princes, and civil officers. He wants the world to be governed by laws and policies so that human lawlessness may be restrained and that everything may be conducted in good order among human beings. For that purpose, He has placed the sword in the hands of the government to punish evil people and protect the good. The clear emphasis on the task of the civil government here is not on some undifferentiated concept of justice, or rather a kind of procedural justice focus. It is focused on a kind of procedural justice that pays attention to the notion of a good order, okay, for which God has placed the sword in the hands of government. Okay, so God treasures and prioritizes and demands order, and that is why He creates government. And my fourth point, so I said 4 points, right? The fourth point is how we as Christians deal with the theme of disruption and order is in a sense a function of the dualism of the religious and the secular that we encounter today, and the prevailing tensions inherent in it. Now, following the terrorist attacks of September 11th and the growing threat of terrorism on our own shores, there has been a growing chorus of opposition to what I call political theology, by which I mean the move to appeal to God or to divine revelation or to scripture to find answers to the political questions of the day. Indeed, Christ in His wisdom was alert to the antithetical mix when He cautioned Christians to render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar and render unto God what belongs to God. Politics is important, but that is not why God made us. While it is our civic duty to engage in politics as citizens, it is our divine calling to look beyond the mundane of this world, to make our calling and election sure, so as to fulfill our higher purpose as citizens of heaven. At the same time, as Christians, as I mentioned earlier, we are to believe that while we are not of the world, we are in this world, and indeed called to be the salt and light of this world. Yet, for many non-Christian observers, such a belief, such an activist belief, is especially worrisome, given what they believe to be the volatile mixture between politics and theology. According to this line of argument, whenever the mundane questions of the day of how to organize society politically get entangled with the supra-mundane issues of the will of God and the law of God, the result is the creation of a combustible combination of irrationality and transcendence-seeking passions that only lead to chaos and conflict. Right? This in a nutshell is the main argument of the so-called New Atheism school. For proponents of the New Atheism school, not only must there be a separation of church and state, something that in fact many Christians are quite ready to accept, but more so the triumph of the secular over the sacred. Conversely, the resilience of a man's faith in an almighty creator who exists independent of the human mind, indeed is the designer and creator of the human mind, is nothing short of perplexing to them. Okay, so I quote to you the words of Mark Lyler, who's one of the proponents, one of the advocates of the New Atheism school. We are disturbed and confused. We find it incomprehensible that theological ideas still inflame the minds of men, stirring up messianic passions that leave societies in ruin. We assume that this was no longer possible, that human beings had learned to separate religious questions from political ones, that fanaticism was dead. We were wrong. The royal we here, of course, refers to the children of the Enlightenment, that great 18th century intellectual movement that managed to cast aside the shackles of superstition and blind faith, right, in the process of liberating man's minds so that they can break free of all these traditions and really discover themselves. The Enlightenment not so much sounded the death knell of religion, but rather managed to harness faith in the service of reason. This was perhaps most profoundly personified in the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the architects and leaders of the Enlightenment. Okay, he believed that secular humanism was in fact an indirect expression of Christian values. Rousseau believed that man was created in the image of God and hence innately good. But in doing so, Rousseau detached this from that all-important Christian teaching of original sin and the fall and man's total dependence on grace for salvation. So for them, religion was no longer about trust in God, but rather in human faculties as their moral compass. And it comes about not by revelation, but by reasoning of the human mind. By this linear reasoning, or humanist eschatology, if you will, secularization is the fate of all humanity, and the triumph of science over the obscurantism of traditional beliefs, including Christianity, is but historical inevitability. Needless to say, this is a view we encounter very often in liberal intellectual circles today.